Claire Whitmore had not been looking for love when she first met Daniel Mercer. She was fresh out of college, starting her first real job at a mid-sized company in downtown Hartford, still finding her footing in the corporate world. Daniel, a few years older, worked there as an administrator, organized and steady, someone the younger employees leaned on when they felt overwhelmed. Their connection began quietly, through small acts of kindness. He helped her navigate systems, showed her the ropes, explained things patiently without ever talking down to her. What began as mentorship soon grew into easy conversations during coffee breaks, then long walks after work, and eventually something more. Over time, Claire discovered just how compatible they were. Daniel wasn't flashy or loud. He was steady, thoughtful, and surprisingly funny when he let his guard down. They both loved music that told a story, road trips with no fixed destination, and the simple joy of cooking a meal together at the end of a long day. Within a year, they had moved in together. Their apartment in Hartford wasn't large, but it was warm and filled with small traditions. Friday night takeout, Sunday morning pancakes, and at least once a month, a little weekend trip to another Connecticut town, or sometimes across state lines to Vermont. Daniel never separated household chores into his and hers. If he got home first, he would cook dinner, sometimes even experiment with new recipes. If Claire was free, she would fold laundry or plan their next getaway. Their life together was seamless, built on quiet gestures of respect. Friends often remarked on how comfortable they seemed, how natural their relationship felt. One detail, though, always stood out. Daniel never touched alcohol. At gatherings, when beers were passed around or wine was poured, he politely declined. "I'm an athlete," he would explain with a smile. "Been boxing since I was 7. My body doesn't handle alcohol well. Honestly, I don't even like the smell." It wasn't offensive, just matter of fact, and most people let it go. Claire admired the discipline. To her, it signaled self-control and commitment, traits she valued deeply. As their relationship matured, talk of marriage became inevitable. Claire's parents, Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, had known for months that she was serious about Daniel. Naturally, they wanted to meet him. So, one Saturday, Claire brought Daniel to the Whitmore home on the east side of Hartford. Margaret, warm and gracious, had prepared a table full of food, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, her famous apple pie. Thomas, more reserved, but equally welcoming, poured drinks and made space at the table. They treated Daniel not as a guest, but almost as family from the moment he walked in. Conversation flowed easily. Thomas asked about Daniel's job, his hobbies, his outlook on life. Daniel, polite and articulate, answered without hesitation. He admitted his love for hiking, his habit of early morning runs along Lake Avalon, his preference for quiet evenings over noisy parties. Margaret noticed the way he looked at Claire, soft but steady, with a kind of protective warmth. Still, as the evening wore on, a subtle question lingered in Margaret's mind. Between bites of pie, she finally asked, "So, Daniel, tell us a little about your family." "Claire hasn't said much. We'd love to know more." Daniel froze just for a moment. It was quick. So quick most people wouldn't have noticed, but Claire did. His smile faltered, then returned, practiced and calm. "Oh, they're in another part of Connecticut," he said lightly. "Not much to tell, really. We don't see each other often." He shifted the topic with disarming charm, asking Thomas about his work in logistics, steering the spotlight away from himself. Margaret exchanged a glance with her husband, then with Claire. It wasn't suspicion exactly, but curiosity. Why had Claire never met his family? Why, in all the time they had been together, had Daniel never brought them up? Claire noticed it too. For the first time since she had fallen for him, she realized there was a part of Daniel's life she knew almost nothing about. It wasn't the absence of detail that unsettled her. It was the way he deflected as though there were doors he refused to open. The night ended warmly. Daniel thanked Margaret for the meal, shook Thomas's hand firmly, and helped Claire with her coat. But as they drove home, the warmth of the evening gave way to an unspoken tension. Claire stared out the window, wondering about the parts of Daniel's story that remained hidden. He had given her his time, his kindness, his love. Yet behind that steady smile, there was a silence, one that seemed to stretch further than the miles between Hartford and whatever town he came from. A silence Claire couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried. Winter had barely lifted when talk of a wedding began to fill the Whitmore household. Margaret loved nothing more than to imagine her only daughter in white walking down an aisle lined with flowers. Every guest rising to watch. Thomas, practical as always, pretended not to care about the details. But Claire caught him smiling when Margaret talked about the first dance or the champagne toast. To her parents, a wedding was not just a formality. It was a celebration of family, tradition, and the life they had worked so hard to give their daughter. Daniel, however, saw it differently. One evening in their small Hartford apartment, over takeout containers and the hum of the radiator, he brought it up. He began carefully. "What would you think about keeping the wedding small? Just us, maybe a few close friends. Something simple like a courthouse ceremony and dinner afterward. No limos, no banquet halls, none of that." Claire tilted her head, surprised. She had always imagined something modest, but still festive. Family gathered, music playing, photographs to frame. "Small, sure," she said, "but you mean no reception at all?" Daniel shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Why spend money feeding 100 people we hardly know? We could use that money for a honeymoon or maybe a down payment on a house, something that actually matters for our future." His reasoning made sense, practical, even romantic in its own way. Yet, when Claire mentioned it to her parents, Margaret gasped in disbelief. "No reception? Absolutely not. Claire, you deserve a proper wedding. We've been waiting for this day since you were born. I don't care if we have to pay for it ourselves. We will. You're our daughter, and you should have the celebration you dream of." Thomas backed her up with a quiet nod. "It's not just about you, too, sweetheart. It's about family, too. About honoring the commitment you're making." Claire stood between them, torn. She wanted to respect Daniel's wishes. But she also couldn't ignore the sparkle in her mother's eyes, the determination in her father's voice. They wanted to give her the kind of day they believed she deserved, a once-in-a-lifetime event. The following weekend, as she and Daniel folded laundry, Claire tried again. "My parents really want a bigger wedding," she said gently. "They're even willing to pay. It's important to them." Daniel's hand stilled a t-shirt caught mid-fold. He set it down, then exhaled. "Claire, my parents won't be there." The words landed heavily. Claire blinked, startled. "What do you mean? You haven't even told them the date yet." "I don't need to," he said, turning away. "They won't come. That's just how it is." "But Daniel," she pressed, "this is your wedding, too. Don't you want your family there? Your mom, your dad, anyone?" He shook his head, jaw tight. "It's not possible. They're busy. Let's just leave it at that." The explanation was thin, barely more than air. Claire felt frustration rise in her chest. It wasn't that his parents couldn't come. Life had obstacles. Everyone understood that. It was the way he shut down the conversation, refusing to offer even the smallest detail, as if the subject itself were forbidden. She tried to smile to let it go. But later that night, lying awake beside him, she couldn't. Daniel had given her every reason to trust him. Yet this silence gnawed at her. Weddings were about union, two families coming together, not just two people signing papers. Why was he so determined to keep his side in the shadows? Claire told herself not to push. He would open up when he was ready. Still, as the days passed, the questions lingered. Why had she never met his family? Why did he never call them, never mention their names? What was he hiding behind that calm, steady face? The doubts were quiet at first, easy to drown out in the rhythm of daily life. But like water seeping through cracks in a wall, they kept returning, soft yet insistent. For the first time since they had moved in together, Claire wondered if she truly knew the man she planned to marry. The idea had been simmering in Claire's mind ever since that night when Daniel, with eyes turned away, insisted his parents would not attend the wedding. He hadn't given her a reason, only a wall of silence. The more he refused to explain, the more her curiosity burned. A week later, Daniel mentioned he had to leave on a short business trip. It wasn't unusual. His job occasionally sent him to other Vermont towns for administrative work. He asked if she wanted to come along, but Claire shook her head, claiming she had reports to finish and little desire to wander alone while he sat in meetings. Daniel accepted her answer easily, kissed her forehead the next morning, and left before dawn with a small overnight bag. Claire watched the taxi pull away from their apartment building, her heart thudding in her chest. She had already made her decision. That evening, while tidying the apartment, she found the confirmation she had been looking for. Inside the glove compartment of Daniel's car, where he sometimes left insurance papers and old mail, there was a folded envelope addressed to Evelyn Mercer in Brookhaven. Claire stared at the name. She remembered Daniel once saying his mother's first name quickly, as though by accident. Evelyn, it had to be her. She held the envelope for a long time, debating. It felt like trespassing, like crossing a line she had promised herself never to cross. But there it was, the address he had hidden, the link to the family he refused to talk about. She slipped the paper into her purse. The next morning, Claire packed a small bag and told her parents she would be running errands outside Hartford. Then she got into her car and set the GPS to Brookhaven. The highway stretched long and flat before her, the winter sun pale and cold against the windshield. As the miles rolled by, the scenery shifted from the bustle of Hartford's outer suburbs to the quieter, grayer edges of Connecticut's Rust Belt. Empty warehouses with broken windows loomed along the road. Old factories, once the heartbeat of steel production, now sat abandoned, their smokestacks pointing like jagged fingers at the sky. Closer to Brookhaven, the decline was impossible to miss. Rows of houses sagged against one another, porches caving in, windows boarded. Some streets looked as though life had bled out of them years ago, leaving only shells behind. A liquor store stood on the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly, even in daylight. Across from it, a half-shuttered diner leaned beneath a faded awning. Claire gripped the wheel tighter. She had grown up in a stable middle-class neighborhood where lawns were mowed and neighbors waved at each other across driveways. Here, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the thud of music spilling from a passing car. Her GPS directed her off the main road and into a narrow residential street. Potholes lined the cracked asphalt. Yards were overgrown. Fences splintered and falling apart. In front of one house, a rusted pickup truck sat on blocks, its tires missing. Laundry flapped stiffly on a line, though the cloth was so worn it was almost colorless. She slowed down, heart pounding. This was the world Daniel had left behind, the world he had never wanted her to see. She thought about his refusal to drink, his avoidance of family talk, his insistence that his parents wouldn't come to the wedding. In this landscape, his silence began to make sense. Claire parked her car near a corner store with a sagging roof and a hand-painted sign. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the address on the paper, unsure if she had the courage to knock on the door once she found it. Her stomach twisted with guilt. She loved Daniel. She trusted him, but she couldn't build a marriage on shadows. Taking a deep breath, she started the engine again and drove deeper into the neighborhood. Each turn seemed to lead her further into abandonment, as though time had forgotten this part of Connecticut. Houses leaned like weary old men. A child's tricycle, rusted and broken, lay overturned in a yard choked with weeds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled long and mournful. The closer she came to the address, the more Claire felt the weight of what she was about to uncover. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about truth. The truth behind the man she loved, the truth he was too afraid or ashamed to share. Finally, she saw the number painted crookedly on a cracked mailbox. Mercer. Her chest tightened. She pulled the car to the curb and turned off the ignition. For a long moment, she didn't move. The house before her sagged under its own weight, the porch littered with beer cans. The curtains yellowed and stiff. Claire closed her eyes, inhaled once, then opened the car door. The cold air bit her cheeks as she stepped out, the sound of her boots crunching against gravel far too loud in the empty street. Whatever secrets Daniel had buried here, she was about to face them alone. Claire stood before the sagging house, the number on the mailbox barely legible beneath layers of rust and peeling paint. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she climbed the creaking porch steps. The smell hit her first: stale beer, sour liquor, and something acid that clung to the boards. For a moment, she almost turned back. She knocked. At first, there was no response, only the muffled drone of a television from somewhere inside. She tried again, louder this time. A voice barked from within, low and irritable. The door cracked open to reveal a woman who looked older than her years. Evelyn Mercer's hair was matted, her face blotched and tired, her eyes rimmed red. A faded bathrobe hung from her thin shoulders, stained with food and liquor. She squinted at Claire suspiciously, gripping the door frame as if to steady herself. "What?" "If you're from an electric company, I told you I don't have it. You can shut it off."
"See if I care."
"No TV, no fridge, doesn't matter." Her words slurred slightly. A bottle of cheap vodka dangling from one hand. Claire froze, heart racing.
I'm
looking for Evelyn Mercer," she said carefully. "You found her." Evelyn's gaze sharpened, scanning Claire from head to toe. The robe shifted as she crossed her arms. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a young voice rang out from deeper inside. "Mom, leave her alone. She's not the power company." A girl appeared in the hallway. A thin figure, maybe 12 years old, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes were startlingly green, sharp and unflinching. She carried herself with a defiance that seemed far too old for her age. "Go back to your room, Sophie." Evelyn snapped, her words coated with bitterness. But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she squared her shoulders and glared at her mother. "You're just going to try to take her money, like you always do. Shut your mouth." Evelyn lunged toward her, swaying on her feet. The vodka bottle sloshed. Sophie darted back a step, her voice rising. "You sold my jacket for booze. You sold the new boots Daniel bought me. You'd sell the phone too if I let you. That's why he doesn't come here anymore." The words hung heavy in the air. Claire felt her stomach drop. Daniel's name spoken with such anger, such raw hurt. Evelyn's face twisted, equal parts shame and rage. "Don't you talk about your brother like you know him.
You don't know what he's done for this family.
You don't know what I've had to do." Sophie's hands clenched at her sides, her small chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. "You've done nothing but drink. Aaron's gone, and Daniel hates this place because of you. And when I grow up, I'm leaving too." Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't waver. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, her mind spinning. She had come searching for answers, and here they were, ugly, raw, spilling out in front of her. Evelyn turned back to Claire, suddenly remembering the stranger on her porch. Her expression hardened. "You, whoever you are, you don't belong here. Get off my property." Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. Part of her wanted to obey, to run back to the safety of her car and forget she had ever come. But then she looked at Sophie, at those fierce green eyes filled with a mix of courage and desperation. The girl's gaze lingered on her, silently pleading, though her lips said nothing. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, stepping back onto the porch. Evelyn slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the brittle walls. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Claire stood there a moment longer, her breath visible in the fading light, her heart pounding as though it might break free of her chest. Through the thin curtains of a cracked window, she caught a glimpse of Sophie retreating down the hall. Her shoulders tense, her small frame hunched against the chaos that filled the house. Claire knew one thing with certainty. Whatever Daniel had tried to bury, whatever silence he had built between his past and his present, it was real, and it was darker than she had imagined. The door had barely slammed when Sophie bolted out the side of the house, her sneakers pounding against the cracked sidewalk. Claire stood frozen for a moment. Then instinct pulled her forward. She couldn't leave the girl alone, not after what she had just witnessed. "Sophie, wait," Claire called, her voice catching in the cold afternoon air. The girl didn't slow. She darted down the street, slipping between two leaning houses, her small frame moving with surprising speed. Claire hurried after her, her boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. Her heart raced, not just from the chase, but from the gnawing sense that if she let Sophie disappear now, she might never find the truth Daniel had spent his life hiding. After several blocks, the road opened into a clearing. An old convenience store squatted on the corner, its sign faded and its windows grimy. Beyond it, a narrow dirt path wound toward a stretch of water glinting faintly in the pale sun, Lake Avalon. Claire spotted Sophie heading in that direction, shoulders stiff, hands shoved into her jacket pockets. Claire ducked into the store first, the bell over the door giving a weak jingle. Inside, the air was stale, lined with shelves of canned soup, dusty boxes of cereal, and a cooler humming with soda and cheap beer. She grabbed a packet of cookies, a stick of beef jerky, and a few brightly wrapped lollipops from a jar by the counter. The cashier, an older man with weary eyes, rang her up without comment. When Claire stepped back outside, Sophie was waiting at the edge of the path, arms crossed. Her eyes, those piercing green eyes, narrowed. "Why are you following me?" Claire held up the bag. "I thought you might want something to eat. That's all." For a moment, Sophie didn't move. Then, with a shrug that tried to look careless, but carried the weight of exhaustion, she turned toward the lake. "Fine, but I'm not going back home right now." Claire followed her down the path. It led to a small lake, ringed by bare trees and scattered rocks. The water was calm, reflecting the washed-out sky. Sophie sat on a fallen log near the bank, pulling her knees to her chest. Claire sat a few feet away, opening the bag and setting the snacks between them. "Here," Claire said softly. "Take whatever you like." Sophie eyed the cookies, then reached for one. She bit into it, chewing slowly, her face unreadable. After a moment, she took a lollipop too, rolling the stick between her fingers. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the shore. Claire didn't rush it. She knew better than to push. Finally, Sophie spoke. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the defiance she'd shown her mother. "You're not from around here. I can tell. Why did you come?" Claire hesitated. The truth pressed against her chest. I know your brother, Daniel." At the sound of his name, Sophie's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. "You're lying." "I'm not," Claire said quickly. "I'm engaged to him. We're supposed to get married soon." For a long moment, Sophie just stared. Then slowly her shoulders dropped. "So that's why he showed up." She looked out at the water, her voice hardening. "He doesn't talk about us, does he?" Claire shook her head gently. "No, he never has. That's why I came. I wanted to understand." Sophie gave a sharp laugh, one that didn't carry any humor. "Of course he doesn't. Why would he? This place, my mom. It's nothing he'd want you to see." Claire stayed quiet, letting the girl's words come on their own. Sophie picked at the wrapper of her lollipop, then began, her voice low but steady. "Daniel used to come home a lot back, when Aaron was still alive. He tried to help, tried to take care of things, but Mom, she was always drinking, selling whatever she could for booze, jackets, shoes, even my school supplies. Daniel stopped bringing stuff, because she'd just traded away. He hated it here, hated her, but he loved us, especially Aaron." Her throat tightened, and she paused. Claire's heart clenched. She could hear the truth pressing at the edges of Sophie's voice. A truth she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. "Aaron was different," Sophie whispered. "He was strong. He always protected me, even from Mom's boyfriends. But one night, one of them came after her with a knife. Aaron stepped in." She stopped, staring at the lake as though the water itself might swallow the memory. "He didn't make it." Claire's chest ached. She wanted to reach out to put a hand on Sophie's shoulder, but she didn't. The girl wasn't asking for comfort. She was telling her story, because no one else would. "That's why Daniel doesn't come back," Sophie said finally, turning those green eyes on Claire. "He blames himself. He thinks if he'd been here, Aaron would still be alive. But he couldn't save him. He couldn't save any of us." The wind rippled across the lake, carrying the bitter smell of smoke from somewhere in the distance. Claire swallowed hard. In that moment, she understood why Daniel never drank, why he never mentioned his family, why he shut down whenever she asked. His silence wasn't pride or secrecy. It was grief. And sitting beside Sophie, Claire knew the truth she had uncovered was only the beginning. The wind off the lake carried a damp chill, and Claire pulled her coat tighter, but she didn't move. Sophie sat hunched forward on the log, elbows on her knees, staring at the water as though the stories trapped inside her would only come out if she kept her eyes fixed on something steady. "There were 4 of us," Sophie began, her voice flat, but edged with a bitterness too old for a 12-year-old.
My oldest sister is Sarah.
She got married before she even finished high school.
She's got kids now, a couple of them, maybe more.
We don't see her much. Then there's Daniel. Then Aaron. He was only a year younger than Daniel. And then me. Claire's breath caught. She could picture Daniel as an older brother, protective and steady. But Aaron, his name hung in the air like a ghost. Sarah's always been kind of a mess. Sophie went on. She married this guy who drinks almost as much as Mom. Sometimes they fight. Sometimes they make up. Sometimes the police come. Social services showed up once. Almost took her kids. She cleaned up just long enough to keep them, but it never really changes. That's just the way things are with her. She picked a thread on her jeans, then tore it free. Daniel left as soon as he could. He went to community college in Hartford, started working, tried to make a life for himself. He'd come back on weekends, bring us food or clothes. He always worried about me and Aaron. He'd yell at Mom, try to make her stop drinking, but it never stuck. She'd just wait until he was gone, and then start again. Claire swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression neutral, though her stomach twisted. Aaron was different, Sophie whispered. He stayed. He tried to hold things together, especially when Daniel was away. He protected me, even from Mom. And he really believed he could save her. Her voice cracked. Claire waited, letting the silence hold space. One winter a couple years ago, Mom was with this guy, Sophie said finally. His name was Tony. He was mean. Always drunk, always angry. One night, he came after her with a knife. I don't even know what they were fighting about. Something stupid, probably. Daniel jumped in. He tried to get between them. Tried to stop Tony. He got stabbed before anyone could do anything. The words hit Claire like a blow. She covered her mouth horrified. By the time the ambulance came, it was too late. Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron bled out on the floor. Daniel wasn't here that weekend. He couldn't make it back because of a snowstorm. He said later that if he'd been here, Aaron wouldn't have died. He screamed at Mom at the funeral. Told her she'd killed him. And maybe she did. If she hadn't let Tony into our lives, Aaron would still be alive. Claire blinked back tears, her throat tight. She could almost see it. The cramped living room, the shouting, the flash of a knife, Aaron collapsing while his little sister watched. Daniel never came back after that, Sophie said. Not really. He showed up one last time to pack his things, and to make sure I had what I needed. He gave me a card, opened a bank account for me, put money in whenever he could, but he wouldn't step inside the house again. He told Mom if she brought another man around, he'd call the cops and have him locked up. And I believed him. Everyone did. People around here don't mess with Daniel anymore. But he still won't come back. Sophie finally turned to look at Claire. Her eyes were wet, but hard, daring Claire to deny her story. That's why he doesn't drink. That's why he never talks about us. He hates alcohol. Hates what it does. Hates her. And he blames himself every single day for Aaron. Claire's chest ached. She wanted to gather the girl into her arms to tell her it wasn't Daniel's fault, that no one could have stopped a storm or changed that night. But she understood now why Daniel had built such thick walls around his past. Every sip of liquor, every shadow of that house carried the memory of blood on the floor and the brother he couldn't save. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The lake shimmered dully, the sun sliding lower, casting the world in shades of gray. Claire stared at the water, trying to absorb the weight of what she had just heard. She thought about the man she knew. The man who laughed softly when she burned pancakes, who folded laundry without complaint, who kissed her hand in passing as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And now beneath all of that, she saw the grief he carried like a second skin. It wasn't shame that kept him silent. It was pain. Pain so deep he couldn't bear to name it. Claire closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time, she fully understood why Daniel never raised a glass, never let himself relax when others lost themselves in drink. For him, alcohol wasn't a casual indulgence. It was the reason his family had fallen apart, the reason his brother was buried in the ground, the reason he kept Sophie at arm's length, though he loved her fiercely. And for Claire, the truth was both devastating and clarifying. The silence that had once unsettled her now made heartbreaking sense. The drive back to Hartford felt longer than the drive out, though the distance was the same. The highway stretched on endlessly, but Claire's mind was heavier now, weighed down by what she had learned at Lake Avalon. Sophie's voice replayed in her head, flat, matter-of-fact, yet filled with wounds so deep they would never fully close. For siblings. A mother consumed by addiction, a brother buried too young, and Daniel caught in the middle of it all. Carrying guilt that was never his to bear, Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel. For years she had wondered about Daniel's silence, his refusal to speak of family, his unyielding avoidance of alcohol. Now she understood. Every sip of whiskey or beer didn't just remind him of the chaos he had escaped. It dragged him back to the night he lost Aaron. His abstinence wasn't discipline alone. It was survival. The city skyline came into view, the familiar outlines of Hartford rising against the fading afternoon sky. Claire's chest ached with conflicting emotions. She loved Daniel more deeply than ever, knowing now the strength it had taken for him to build a new life. But she couldn't ignore the girl she had left behind. Sophie, with her fierce green eyes and brittle courage, was still stuck in that collapsing house, still bracing against the chaos that had already stolen too much from her. When Claire finally stepped into her parents' home that evening, Margaret noticed the shadow in her daughter's eyes at once. Dinner sat waiting on the table. Roast chicken, potatoes, the comforting smells of a safe and steady household. But Claire couldn't taste any of it. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Margaret asked softly, touching her hand. Claire hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing you can fix, Mom. Just I've been thinking about the wedding." Thomas looked up from his plate, curious. "Changed your mind about the big party already?" His tone was light, but there was an edge of surprise. Claire drew a steady breath. "Yes, I don't want the big wedding. I don't need the banquet halls, the limousines, or the flowers. What I want is simple. Just Daniel, me, and the people who matter most, and that means Sophie should be there." The room fell quiet. Margaret's brows knit in confusion. "Sophie. She's his little sister," Claire explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I met her. She deserves better than the life she's stuck in. She deserves to see her brother start fresh, to know she's not forgotten." Thomas leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Claire, we don't even know this girl." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Claire interrupted, her tone firm. She glanced between them, her parents' familiar faces lined with concern. "You've given me everything. Stability, safety, love. Sophie has none of that. If Daniel and I are starting a new life, I want her to be part of it, not left behind." Margaret exchanged a glance with Thomas, her expression softening. "You really care about her?" Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "She's just a child, Mom. She's had to grow up too fast. Daniel won't admit it, but he's been keeping her afloat from a distance, and I can't marry him while pretending she doesn't exist. Our wedding should be about love and family, and she is his family." Silence lingered for a moment. Then Margaret reached across the table, squeezing Claire's hand. "If this is what you want, then we'll support you no matter what." Thomas sighed, shaking his head slowly, but there was no anger in his eyes, only resignation and a trace of pride. "All right, no grand wedding. If bringing this girl into your life makes you happy, then that's what we'll do." Relief washed over Claire. For the first time since she had left Brookhaven, she felt a sliver of hope. The road ahead would be complicated. Daniel's pain wouldn't vanish overnight, and Sophie's world couldn't be repaired with a single gesture. But Claire knew one thing with certainty. Love wasn't just about sharing joy. It was about shouldering burdens together, about refusing to turn away from the people who needed you most. That night, as she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, Claire imagined a wedding not filled with glittering chandeliers or endless guest lists, but a small circle of people who truly mattered. She pictured Daniel standing beside her, steadier than ever, and Sophie, shy but present, watching her brother begin a life where the shadows of their past no longer define them. And for the first time, Claire felt peace. Not because the questions were gone, but because she finally knew the answers. The days slipped by as spring edged closer, and talk of the wedding lingered in the air. Claire found herself restless, unable to keep the truth she had uncovered locked away any longer. Each time she looked at Daniel, his steady hands making coffee, his calm voice discussing their future, she saw the shadows behind his eyes. She carried Sophie's words inside her like a secret too heavy to bear. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Claire folded her hands tightly and took a breath.
Daniel, she said softly,
I need to tell you something. He looked up, distracted at first, then weary when he noticed the tension in her voice. What is it? I went to Brookhaven. Her words landed like stones on the table between them. For a moment he said nothing. Then his face drained of color, his mouth parting in shock. You what? His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back. Claire, why would you? How could you? I met Sophie. The name seemed to freeze him. His hand trembled against the edge of the table. You shouldn't have gone there, he whispered, his voice sharp with panic. You don't know what that place is like. You don't know what she's been through. What I've been trying to keep you away from. You weren't supposed to see any of it. Claire reached across the table, her fingers brushing his arm. Daniel, listen to me. I do know now. I saw the house. I saw Evelyn. And I talked to Sophie. She's just a child, Daniel. She needs you. And she needs to know she's not forgotten. He pulled back as though her touch burned. His breathing quickened, his eyes dark and frantic. You don't understand. I've kept you away from that world. For a reason. It's toxic. It destroys everything it touches. I promised myself I'd never drag you into it. Her voice steadied, calm against the storm rising in him. I understand more than you think. I know about Aaron. Sophie told me. Daniel flinched as if struck. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he stared at her in silence. Then slowly he sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with the weight of memories he had never shared. I should have been there, he said hoarsely. If I hadn't stayed in Hartford that weekend, if I had just pushed through the storm, Aaron would still be alive. He wouldn't have had to fight alone. I failed him, Claire. I failed my brother. Claire's eyes blurred with tears, but her voice remained firm. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped that night. No one could. You didn't fail him, Daniel. You were a kid yourself. You've carried this guilt for years. But it doesn't belong to you. He shook his head violently. You don't know what it's like to live with that picture in your head. The blood, the screaming. My mother too drunk to even realize what had happened until it was too late. I told myself I'd never go back, that I'd cut it off forever. It's the only way I've survived. Claire leaned closer, her hand resting gently over his clenched fists. Survival isn't enough. Sophie is still there. She looks up to you. She loves you. And whether you like it or not, she is part of our life now. When we get married, I want her there. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she is your family. Our family. Daniel lifted his eyes, red-rimmed and raw. You really mean that? I do, Claire whispered. We can't change the past, but we can change the future for her, for us, for Aaron's memory. Don't you think he would want that? Daniel swallowed hard, his body trembling as if every word had cracked open the wall he had built. At last he nodded, his voice barely audible. Yes, he would. Silence settled, but it was no longer heavy with secrets. For the first time, Daniel allowed his pain to be seen, and Claire, steady and unflinching, held it with him. In that moment, the wedding stopped being about parties or traditions. It became about redemption, about building a family not defined by the brokenness of the past, but by the choice to stand together in the present. On a bright Saturday morning in late spring, Claire and Daniel stood together at the Brookhaven County Courthouse. There was no grand aisle, no orchestra, no sweeping floral arrangements, just sunlight streaming through tall windows, bouncing off polished floors, and the low hum of a clerk preparing their paperwork. Claire wore a cream-colored dress that brushed her knees, elegant in its simplicity. Daniel stood beside her in a navy suit, his posture straight, but his hands trembling slightly. When the judge asked them to join hands, Claire felt the strength of his grip, the quiet determination that had carried him through so much darkness. The ceremony was brief. A handful of words, vows spoken softly, signatures scrolled across paper, and then it was done. They were husband and wife. Claire's parents clapped, Margaret dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Thomas cleared his throat gruffly, hiding emotion behind formality. Two of Daniel's closest friends from work offered warm congratulations. But the moment that struck deepest was when Sophie, dressed in a borrowed floral dress and sandals that Claire had bought her just days before, stepped forward. She looked small, almost fragile, yet her eyes shone with pride. "You look beautiful," she whispered to Claire before throwing her arms around Daniel. He bent down, holding her close, his face buried in her hair. For the first time in years, he let himself believe that family didn't have to mean pain. After the courthouse, they all walked to a small diner just down the street. It wasn't fancy, vinyl booths, chrome stools, the smell of bacon and coffee lingering in the air, but it felt right. They filled a corner table with laughter and plates of pancakes, omelets, and burgers. Claire's best friend snapped photos on her phone, capturing moments more genuine than any staged portrait. Daniel cutting a piece of cake, with Sophie grinning beside him. Margaret showing the girl how to stir cream into her coffee. Thomas leaning back with a rare smile as he watched his daughter glow with happiness. The waitress, curious about the small gathering, eventually caught on that it was a wedding celebration. She brought out a slice of pie with congratulations, scrolled in chocolate syrup, refusing to take payment for it. The entire table cheered as Claire and Daniel shared a forkful. It wasn't champagne in crystal glasses, but it was sweeter than anything either of them had imagined. When the meal ended, Daniel stood and cleared his throat, his voice catching as he addressed the table. "I know this isn't the kind of wedding people expect, but for me, it's more than I could have asked for. For years, I thought I didn't deserve this. Peace, love, a family that believes in me. Today proves I was wrong." And having Sophie here, his voice broke. He reached for his sister's hand. "It means everything." Sophie squeezed back, her chin trembling though she held her head high. "I'm glad you didn't forget me," she whispered, audible enough for only him and Claire. Later, as the plates were cleared and coats gathered, Daniel pulled Claire aside. He held a small envelope, documents tucked neatly inside. "I already talked to a lawyer," he said, his voice low but steady. "I want to start the process of becoming Sophie's guardian. CPS will need to evaluate and there'll be court hearings, but I don't want her left in that house any longer than she has to be." Claire's eyes brimmed with tears. She touched his cheek, smiling through the emotion swelling in her chest. "We'll do it together. She's our responsibility now. Our family outside." The afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light. Daniel, Claire, and Sophie walked side by side, the girl holding both their hands as though afraid to let go. For years, Daniel had carried only guilt and loss when he thought of family. Now, with Claire on one side and Sophie on the other, he felt something entirely new. Hope. After the simple ceremony and the small diner celebration, life began to shift in ways Claire had only dared to imagine. Their apartment, once quiet and perfectly arranged, now carried the sounds of a 10-year-old adjusting to a new world. Claire's laughter echoed down the hallway when she found a pair of rollerblades at a thrift shop Sophie had taken her to. Her school books spread across the kitchen table in the evenings, her scribbled notes mixing with Daniel's work files and Claire's lesson plans. At first, Sophie moved cautiously through the apartment as though afraid the welcome might wear thin. But each day, Claire and Daniel reminded her she belonged. They cooked together, shared stories at dinner, and made new routines. Claire helped her with homework while Daniel showed her how to throw a proper punch at the local boxing gym. Slowly, the haunted look in Sophie's eyes began to soften. Of course, nothing about the transition was simple. Within weeks, Daniel was on the phone with lawyers and social workers, starting the process that would make him Sophie's legal guardian. Child Protective Services scheduled home visits, checking their apartment for safety, reviewing their finances, interviewing both Daniel and Claire. The court required background checks, letters of reference, proof of steady employment. It was exhausting, but Daniel never complained. One evening, after yet another long call with their lawyer, Daniel sank onto the couch, running a hand over his face. "It feels like they're measuring every inch of me, waiting for me to fail." Claire sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "They're not waiting for you to fail. They just want to be sure Sophie's safe, and she is. You've already been taking care of her in every way that matters." Her words proved true. At the first hearing, the judge reviewed the case, noting Daniel's clean record, his stable job, and the strong support system provided by Claire and her family. Evelyn didn't contest the petition. In fact, she didn't even show up. By the end of the summer, Daniel received full guardianship of Sophie. The day they walked out of the courthouse, Sophie clutched the official papers in her hands like a shield against everything she had endured. Daniel bent down, his voice breaking. "You're with us now. For good. No one can take that away." Claire blinked back tears as Sophie buried her face in her brother's chest. In that moment, the Mercer family began to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by choosing a different future. Months later, on a gray November morning, Daniel suggested something he had avoided for years. "I want to take you both to see Aaron." His tone was steady, though his hands twisted together nervously. So they drove back toward Brookhaven, the air crisp with the bite of early winter. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside town, quiet and still, leaves brown and brittle, clung stubbornly to bare branches. Daniel carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, his steps heavy as he led the way to a modest headstone carved with his brother's name. Aaron Mercer, beloved son and brother. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. He sank to his knees in front of the grave, his shoulders trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of years. "I should have been here. I should have protected you." Tears streaked down his face. He pressed his hand against the cold stone, his breath visible in the chill air. Claire knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his back. Sophie stood close, silent but steady, her small hand resting on her brother's shoulder. "You didn't fail him," Claire murmured. "You've carried that guilt for too long. Aaron wouldn't want you to live this way. He'd want you to keep going, to protect Sophie, to live the life you both dreamed of." Daniel closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. For years, he had carried the moment of his brother's death like a chain around his neck. But here, with his wife and sister beside him, he felt the weight begin to lift. The grief was still there. It always would be, but for the first time it no longer defined him. As they stood, snowflakes began to fall, soft, delicate, the first of the season. The cemetery grew quiet, blanketed in a hush that felt almost holy. Claire slipped her hand into Daniel's, while Sophie held the other. Together, they stood before Aaron's grave, a family rebuilt from loss. Daniel drew in a deep breath, the cold air sharpening his lungs, and let it out slowly. "I forgive myself," he whispered. It wasn't dramatic, not a proclamation shouted into the wind, but it was real, and it was enough. The three of them walked back to the car as the snow swirled gently around them, covering the ground in a thin white veil. It was the beginning of winter, but also for them the beginning of something else, a new life defined not by what they had lost, but by what they had chosen to build together. For Claire, the moment carried a message she would never forget. Love and compassion could not erase tragedy, but they could transform it. They could take the sharpest pain and soften it, turning wounds into scars that no longer bled, but told a story of survival. And for Daniel, the message was even simpler. Family was not the chaos he had been born into.
It was the people who stood by him now.
Claire, steady and unyielding, and Sophie, fierce and unbreakable. Together, they were proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. As the snow fell thicker, coating the earth in silence, Claire knew the truth. Love and forgiveness were stronger than grief. And in that truth, the Mercer